Today we remember the East India Trading Company as the vast extractive colonial government which it grew into through the 18th century, but right now they're barely getting off the ground. It's 1610 and the sixth voyage of the East India Company is leaving England bound for Surat. The company already has a problem though, and it's one they never really solve. Once the fleet is at sea, the directors in London lose all operational control over their employees, their servants. But strange as it sounds, over the course of years, this weakness eventually comes to benefit the company. Take Sir Henry Middleton, for example. He's been selected by the directors to command the sixth voyage. Once the fleet sets sail, he immediately becomes one of the most powerful men in the company. He can discipline or ignore his officers. He can negotiate treaties with kings and with emperors. He could wage war if he wanted to. And if he decides to enrich himself rather than the shareholders in London, there's very little they can do about it. A letter to India takes 6 months, and the reply takes another 6. So by the time the directors read about what's happening, the situation's long since changed, which leaves the directors with one big question. How do you control someone you can't personally supervise, can't easily communicate with, and may never even see again? The East India Trading Company spent much of the next century trying to answer that question, but with the limitations of the technology of the time, and with information travelling at the speed of the sail in the wind, there's really no solution.
But when we came there, our ships they did scan. They saw by our colours we were Englishmen. Oh, they laughed in their lingo, and at us did fleer. You rebels of England, what do you do?
From the outset, the directors already knew what they were up against. Trading companies like the Barbary Company and the Dutch East India Company had already struggled with it for years. So before the company ever commissioned its first ship, safeguards had already been designed. Every merchant, sailor and officer signed extremely detailed contracts which told them exactly how they were expected to behave. And alongside this, they paid a bond. Depending on how rich the servant already was, the company would collect between £100 to £500, which the offender would lose if they broke the rules. But in theory at least, misconduct, disobedience, disloyalty were expensive. For this system to work though, the directors need surveillance, and over the course of the first decade of company activity, they demanded more and more reports from their servants. Every lieutenant on the fleet kept a journal, merchants kept account books, pursers recorded every penny spent, and officers from the master's mate to the pilot kept their own records too. Every account book was to be inspected every day by fleet captains at sea, and then by leading merchants at company factories once they were ashore, and finally a copy would make its way back to the directors. By 1610, the director's office in London, known as East India House, was overwhelmed with the enormous stacks of paperwork flooding back aboard each returning ship. And it sounds like a good system. By comparing enough records, discrepancies appear, and if you catch enough discrepancies, you can catch corruption. This usually meant private trading, that's trade done for personal profit of the servant rather than for the company's benefit. Though the directors were wary of all forms of misconduct, from thievery to piracy to moral degeneracy. If you're paying attention though, you already notice the problem here. The system relies on officers keeping truthful journals, on merchants recording accurate and honest accounts, on servants choosing not to conceal information that they would benefit from hiding, and on men like Henry Middleton prioritising the company above everything else.
Hope in the Lord, on him repose thy trust, serve him with fear.
Everyone in company employment was aware they were under constant observation, and with such a refined system in place, why would you bother breaking the rules at all? You'd lose your career, your money, you'd forever taint your reputation in an industry in which personal ties and trust really mattered. It looks like only the choice a fool or a villain, or a foolish villain, would make. But for the sailors in the fleet and the merchants in the factories, the situation looks quite different. There was a saying in the Bombay factory in the 18th century that 2 monsoons are the age of man. Sailing with the East India Company was absurdly dangerous and everyone knew it. Before the sixth voyage even set sail, the directors had already planned a replacement in the event of the chief factor, Lawrence Vermel's death. And then his replacement, and then another, and another. And by the time the directors were finished, the list of succession after Vermel was 12 men long. If Vermel survived the voyage, he had the privilege of choosing his own successor. But he didn't. Lawrence Vermel died 6 months before the fleet arrived in Surat. He didn't even survive the voyage there. If you spend any time reading records from just about any period of the company's history, Vermel's fate isn't surprising. Any number of things might happen to you. You could fall overboard in a storm, the ship might sink or run aground, you could starve to death or succumb to scurvy. Many servants were dead before they'd even rounded the Cape of Good Hope. And for those that survived all of that, they had the likelihood of malaria or dysentery and fever to deal with, never mind the threat of imprisonment or death at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Mughals, or pirates, all of whom were floating around the Indian Ocean. Historian Santhi Hijibu, in a study of company servants in the 1700s, found that 71% of men who entered the Bengal service were dead within 15 years. Joining any voyage was an enormous gamble. Official wages were relatively low, and even worse, servants could only collect them when they made a safe return to England. And a remarkable number of them never saw England again. Mortality rates through much of the company's history are staggering. And the fact that servants from lowly fleet sailors to men like Henry Middleton were aware of their own mortality dulled the tools used by the directive committee to try and control them. The promise of a future award, as given to you on a piece of paper you signed in England, is hardly an incentive when your colleagues, your leaders, your friends are dropping like flies around you. When dying in India looks to be a matter of time, allegiance to shareholders doesn't depend on how high your rank is. Everyone working overseas had the same interests regardless of what their employers wanted. Maximising earnings whilst minimising time actually spent overseas. So shared interests between friends and colleagues created networks of trust and loyalty based on geography. The division isn't low versus high rank, it's operations in Asia versus interests in London. In London, private trade looks like greed or blatant corruption, but in Surat or Bantam or the deck of a fleet ship somewhere in the Indian Ocean, it's kind of common sense. It's a way to make the gamble of sailing to India pay off. If you survived, you'd return to England a rich man with a fortune great enough to buy an estate, power and status. And if you didn't, well, the company were never really going to compensate you anyway.
My chains and jewels, everyone shall be thine own, and eke 100 pound in gold which lies unknown.
Once company servants decided to put themselves first, London's surveillance system was surprisingly easy to work around. As we know, by 1610, the directors are pushing for more information. They introduced the Black Book of Misdemeanors, and it is what it sounds like. It was intended to collect every allegation made against company servants. But from the first page to the very last, the same complaint appears time after time. Private trade. And the problem's still there a century later. Santhi Hijibu found that over a third of Bengal officials were sending home fortunes that vastly exceeded anything they could have earned from their official salaries. They're absurd sums of money. Some of these transactions would amount to millions of pounds today. And since the people writing the account books were the same people the account books were meant to be monitoring, they are so easy to manipulate. At Bantam in 1617, for example, the chief factor, George Ball, simply refused to send Richard Cox's account books to London. I wonder who named that guy. Partly because they were frankly ineptly compiled by Cox, but definitely because it was better for Ball and Cox not to send them to London. Who's naming these people and why are they working together? This is despite repeated demands from the directors for a copy of the books. But what could they do about it? Make the 6-month-long voyage to go and get them? I don't think so. Bantam seemed to be very good at obscuring information, either intentionally through bad handwriting and secret codes or just withholding the books. or by accident if you're Richard Cox. The only records of this man's existence are that he is really, really bad at his job. All of this earned the factory a reputation at the time, with one factor in a neighbouring posting saying that those in Bantam were very loath to spoil a sheet of paper by writing on it. Even when potentially credible accusations of wrongdoing did emerge, they very often went nowhere. Take the preacher William Lesk, for example. He was sent to India to instill the servants with good Christian morality and virtues, but by 1617 he's been bound in ropes by the Surat merchants, thrown on board a ship, and he was taken home under arrest with a long list of accusations from chronic drunkenness to violence to even attempted murder. What did Lesk do in response? He claimed everyone accusing him was privately trading. And suddenly, the directive committee have two completely contradictory stories talking about the same event that happened months ago, thousands of miles away. They had no way of determining who was telling the truth, so in the end, neither side was punished. Sometimes the directors would hire agents specifically to go and spy on their merchants, but these people often ended up joining the private trade too. Now, don't get me wrong, collecting all of these reports wasn't a complete waste of time. It was London's only way to generate a picture of how their company was performing. But as tools of control, they're far less useful. The distance between London and Asia created an information gap, and the merchants in Asia were clever enough to know exactly how to exploit it. People were loyal to their friends, colleagues, people they lived and worked alongside every day, people who they could trust to help them make money because, in many cases, like for the sailors of the sixth voyage, they were people who had fought off Ottoman boarding parties together, and who've stood alongside each other as Portuguese galleys hurled cannonballs their way. And London, meanwhile, was just a collection of signatures at the bottom of a contract, and maybe an occasional angry letter.
He was much taken upon a sudden, he shifted his trencher as soon as he spied the board and the bacon. By that it is plain, the devil's a wencher with hey down, down and a down.
There's one last safeguard in place now, although the contracts weren't enough and the paperwork couldn't be trusted. Surely the men in command on the ground, or I guess on the sea, could keep everyone else in line. Sir Henry Middleton had been appointed as General of the Sixth Voyage with great care. He was everything the directors wanted in a general: experienced, respected, capable, someone with a reputation for good behaviour and gentlemanly conduct. He had already sailed on the first voyage in 1601, and he led the second voyage in 1604. So he was tested and competent, and if anyone could be trusted to uphold company interests, surely it's Sir Henry Middleton. Don't forget that once the fleet was at sea, there's nobody above him. King James I even gave him the power of martial law over his men. It was Middleton who would coordinate the fleet and its navigation, conduct negotiations with foreign powers, direct and discipline his officers, and even start and fight battles if he needed to. And since long-distance oversight was impossible, these voyages couldn't happen without that kind of autonomy. But as we've already seen, company interests are reliant on enforcement from men whose behaviours they couldn't really influence. So how does Middleton get on? Well, by 1611, just about a year after setting sail, we know from letters he sent to another captain in his fleet, Nicholas Downton, that Middleton was in Yemen, not Surat. He'd been welcomed onto Mocha as a guest by the Ottoman Turks, only to be attacked by them a few days later. A few of his men were killed in the fray. Middleton survived but was chained by the neck and was now sitting in a prison cell. But he was still in command of the fleet. There was no procedure to replace Middleton without his consent, and Middleton, understandably, had little desire to risk spending the rest of his life in a prison cell in Yemen. So from prison, Middleton ordered the fleet to wait, and for 6 months they waited. In the meantime though, they were on the wrong side of the Indian Ocean for half a year, Money was spent replenishing dwindling supplies, all the whilst precious trading time slipped away. Middleton's job looks hard enough already, but imagine trying to do it from a prison cell. In letters to another captain, Nicholas Downton said that although Middleton was still alive, practical control over the fleet had effectively broken down, which is true. Middleton himself had opened negotiations with the Ottoman Turks, despite having no legal basis to do so. Middleton still had total authority, but he didn't have total control anymore. Eventually, Sir Henry Middleton did make a daring and successful prison break, stepping back aboard his flagship in May 1612, but not long after this, further accusations appear regarding Henry Middleton. In September 1612, the chief factor of the Surat factory, the same one that tied up that priest and threw him on the boat, Thomas Aldworth, wrote that Middleton, who I hope had just spent a lovely summer out of prison, arrived with 2 or 3 fleet ships and had forced them to deliver him goods and other things at such rates as pleased him, and also that he took diverse other things without giving anything for it. Now, this goes beyond the self-preservation like we saw in that prison cell on Mocha. This looks like personal enrichment at the company's expense. The entire reason Middleton and the 6th Fleet had been sent out in the first place was to establish stable trade with the Mughals in Surat. But instead, his actions were creating a diplomatic crisis which threatened the continuation of company trade in the entire region. When it was demanded of him, Middleton refused to pay the Mughal governor of the port for the stolen goods, which culminated in the factory purser, Mr. Canning, being arrested by city authorities and handed over to their European rivals, the Portuguese. So Middleton ended up responding to the distance, danger and opportunities of company service, just like every other man beneath him. And if anything, the rank and power granted to him just gave Middleton greater freedom to enrich himself and his crews. But the directors really didn't have any alternative. Now, before the century was over, directors had stopped trying to solve the problem. They realised that no matter what contracts had been agreed to, how many reports they collected, or how many inspections and punishments were carried out, that they couldn't reliably control people living 6 months away. So instead of trying to stamp out private trade, the company gradually came to accept it through the last decades of the 1600s. The vast fortunes of Mughal wealth, returning in the purses of former company men, would go on to influence British imperial policy, but I think that's a story for another time. Sir Henry Middleton joined many other company servants before him in death in 1613, 3 years after he set sail, and before the decade was over, Thomas Aldworth, his accuser, was dead as well. Neither lived to see the company grow into what we remember it as today. They didn't see the consequences of their actions unfold, nor, in the end, did they reap any benefit from the gamble they'd chosen to take. Maybe it's tempting to judge Sir Henry Middleton as unusually corrupt, but I think he was just responding to the same incentives as everyone else around him. The difference, though, is that his position as general gave him far greater freedom to act on them. Contrary to his rank or authority assuring he remained loyal to the company, Middleton acted with the same impulses as Thomas Aldworth did in pursuing private trade, and George Ball did in Bantam by ignoring the demands of the directors for his account. So, rather than finding a way to control their servants, one of the most important realizations the East India Company ever made was that they really couldn't. The technology just wasn't there yet. The success or failure of the company in these early stages depended on men given enormous freedoms to act on its behalf, freedoms which can't be separated from self-interest. Accepting that reality and adapting to it is one of the defining features in the company's development. Without needing to wait for permission from London, officers were able to grasp at the chance they had to expand company territory, sometimes through violent conquest, and company servants were empowered to take decisive action at speeds which outcompeted their European rivals. It was a compromise that helped transform the company from a feeble trading venture that first showed up trying to sell heavy woolen broadcloth in the Indian heat into one of the most powerful corporations the world has ever known.
A rich merchant man that was both grave and wise did kill a man at Hendon town through quarrels that did rise. Through quarrels that did rise, the German he was dead. And for this fact the merchant man was judged to lose his head. A sweet thing